BIP of Bizarre Interest Productions, and since we've talked about fathers, it's been a while since I loaded a proper video. Let's talk about fathers in Kamen Rider, particularly the Reiwa era. The Heisei era was known for having some antagonistic dads before. Double, Wizard, Drive, Ghost, X8, and Build all showed us it's not as black and white, since some of them aren't necessarily villains to their families, though Reiwa's had good, bad, and morally gray dads that skew the line. And while there's an argument to be had, we should have more mothers, I'll probably do one next year for Mother's Day, but semantics. Let's explore how Reiwa has handled fatherhood to an extent. If you made it this far, type Junpei June, and let's get started. Up is 01. Soryo is interesting because whether or not the series aged well regarding artificial intelligence is a discussion for another day. On its own merits, Soryo was able to raise Aruto and have enough of a singularity to try and motivate Aruto to follow his dreams, and even in the alternate timeline, gave his son a test of passage to see if he was ready to be the first Reiwa rider, and ended up becoming a driving force to send Zeya into space to help Aruto down the line. Which is funny, since his model ended up creating Horobi. Now, Horobi's interesting because while I think he's a cool villain, I wouldn't call him a good parent. Like, Jin starts to respect other human gears, and Horobi hacks him to make him more subservient to the arc. But ironically, the caring side of Jin's personality shines after Assault Wolf Vulcan takes Horobi down, and Jin decides to continue his mission. And even when both become more active at the same time, they don't see eye to eye, and Horobi considers turning against Arc, only to end up to decide to end humanity, and only after Aruto refuses to kill him does he finally get to see where Jin's perspective was coming from. From what I saw, because I did not watch the last 5 episodes, that was the point. Ironically, for the parent, Jin didn't think things through, but he was much more willing to follow their own individuality, something that the parent and Horobi unironically needed to learn more. On to Saber, we got Ryo Ogami, the strongest swordsman and powerful parent, but we see him be more emotionally grounded than most of his characters. He was able to give advice on the battlefield and emotionally tries to connect with the newer and younger members of the guild. Hence why he tried to have Toma prove himself the first time. But ironically, for a character that's seen as static, it's his relationship with his son that becomes his push. When the Southern base bans Toma as a traitor, after the first confrontation, he gets suspicious and listens to Yuri's warning. Then Reika threatens his son Sora as an emotional bargaining chip. So, yeah, Ryo decides to just ask and trust his son on what he should do. When he does, he decides to test Toma out in a battle to test his resolve and growth as a swordsman. And once Toma is able to prove himself, Ryo decides to support his newbie and leave the Sword of Logos. Toma becomes a father in the sequel V-Cinema, Trio of Deep Sin, which I need to watch also. There we learn his bookshelf burned down, but he started over and adopted a kid who, long story short, their adult self ended up as a member of the Deep Sin trio alongside those connected to his other friends who wanted revenge, but Mamiya isn't able to go through with it because, as it turns out, his connection to Riku and Toma's treatment of Riku allowed Mamiya to recognize that Toma's care for a child he never met beforehand was genuine, and instead of a fight, that clears Mamiya's hatred and motivates him to make things right. Oh, I forgot to include this in the script, but you also have Rinso's father who showed up in the film, who abandoned his wife and son in order to protect them and didn't expect Rinso to end up in the Sword of Logos, and even admits to Rinso that what he's doing and why, because he wants to protect the world from what he sees as destructive sabers in the Sword of Logos because of all the people that have died as a result of all the fights that went around. And he used to defend the same people before Demeki began wearing his Sword of Logos, but because of all the casualties, he blames both sides, and if Demeki are gone, well, the Sword of Logos would be easier to take down. And, you know, his town was raided too, and had he kept Rinso with him, Rinso would have died, so it kind of makes sense. Even says before, the grudge of the dead lives on forever, and will continue to shackle you until the end of times. And before he ends up getting defeated by Rinso, he actually acknowledges that his son has grown up pretty well, and when the timeline gets reset, he's just happy that Rinso is doing well, which I think is a good message about moving on and accepting that the new generation can help and improve from what the failure generation could do. Oh, gonna be honest, I've watched 90% of 01 and Saber except for their V-Cinemas and final episodes, so I had to do a lot of digging and research for those. Revice and Gav, I also have to research just enough, so if I get something wrong, I don't want to just spread misinformation, unlike some channels, but let me know if I do. But reading about Gensa and Junpei's story, it's really amazing as a father. He had the origin of a Kamen Rider, but instead he stuck as Noah's lapdog, forced to work with his own parents' killer, And it's only thanks to the love from meeting Yukimi that gets him to leave. And when Veil arrives, he's able to resist the urge to use it long enough to cancel the transformation and leave so that Veil can't use him anymore. He doesn't just abandon them or is an absentee parent, but generally prefers to not have that influence harm his children, but still returns to do his part and help out with ultimate advice, then steps into the fray himself when Daiji has gone too far. And when they have their final fight, Veil understands Genta's point, but would rather be sealed inside his host instead of learning from Genta. And in a way, rejecting the opportunity to be a dad to his own demon children, while Genta got what he wanted. Family, putting his demons to rest, and keeping them safe. Heck, Akaishi saw Daiji as a son figure to mold, but Masumi reflects what Genta could have been. He distanced himself from his son and put his own demon inside him, and when they start making amends, he has to die for the cause, which ends up resolving with George moving on when he had done what Genta did. He probably could have avoided that tragedy between father and son. Speaking of which, I have no idea what the hell is wrong with Kamen Rider fans who think getting rid of characters that represent a core aspect of a show about family, particularly found and adoptive family, important. But thinking about Tasuke and the Ushijima family, all of them lost their other family members and essentially became an adoptive family. And yet, despite doing so undercover, all of them felt like the rest were their newfound family, which makes it all the more heartbreaking when they die. With Tasuke saving Hikaru at the last second and calling him his son in his final words. Just because they lost their family doesn't mean that the new one that they made was fake. And Hikaru at least got to avenge him, but also needed a reminder from the friend that he only made because of their trauma about moving forward. Too bad people just hate them and spread misinformation about Hikaru's agency, demanding he get more focus, despite that not being how agencies work. And the fact that Genta's actor worked under the same agency but also disappeared because he has more projects that he was working on. But hey, who needs facts when agenda pushing is the way to go? Sure hope that's not relevant in a future video. Moving on to Geats, good dad to talk about is going to be hard, but let's start with Takahito, aka Ginpin. Despite him being strict to Keiwa in his interview, you have to give him props in entering a death game to save his son from his medical condition, and you also have to give him respect for that. Archimedo's also an interesting case. Despite being a villain and using them for the game, Art got fed up with his babies being used for the game and treated them like his own children, trying to mold them into stronger creatures and riders capable of sentient thought, eventually letting himself get eaten so that he could become one with them and fight as their vanguard, and he gets a surprisingly sweet send-off. Kyosei is complicated, and he's in the morally gray zone because he starts off seemingly supporting and open to Neon's independence, only to reveal he sees her as a replacement for Akari, whose death made him shut his heart out. Yet he wants Neon to aim for the future and find a husband she wants, not that he has to choose. Oh yeah, he messed up trying to keep the secret with her to the grave, but at least he wants Neon to actually find love from someone. Like, the grief was so bad, Neon offered to erase his memories. And he eventually takes a stand as a writer to protect his new daughter. And while I needed Irumi's development to be on screen more, the fact that she and Kosei were able to admit he still loved his kids and fight back against the first one's killer, including finally telling Neon that he loves her, speaks volumes. I know some people thought the execution wasn't handled well, but he powered through the pain to avenge Akari's death. And with the fantasy buckle passed on the torch for Neon's love speaks volumes. I wouldn't say he was a good parent, but an example of a parent stricken by grief who had to accept the pain to become a better father. Moving on to Gotchard, let's talk about Fuga briefly. Already did a video on him, but it says a lot that as a father, despite the circumstances he found himself in, especially compared to Kosei, he never wavered in his love for his daughter or being the father figure for the next generation. He lost many of his allies, but still kept his convictions in face of an organization too lazy, incompetent, and conservative to ever see if Grion wasn't manipulating them. But with him as a parent exclusively, the fact that he immediately goes out of his way to find Rinne in the dream world once she takes the nightmare spell, he already had the alchemist driver ready for her, and he trusts her with the power to do so while he's still recovering from his injuries, still speaks volumes. And when the truth comes out, Rinne ends up following her own convictions against the organization's wishes, just like he did. Then his homunculi returns to help out, and after she gets whooped by the first two chemis with the trio, Fuga immediately transforms, claiming he will light the path forward for the next generation and transforms to beat them, even encouraging her when her homunculi clone dies that they'll meet again. Even when he returns, the final arc revealing Grion was so jealous of Fuga that he modeled Atropos and gaslit her by reusing Fuga's parenting methods that Atropos was convinced he was worth following speaks volumes. Especially since before the reveal he was using his daughter, Fuga was still willing to work with him to get their daughters back and felt sympathy for Atropos despite the fact that she was just cloned after his own daughter. And even then, he finally gets to work with Rinne in battle and defeats the kings responsible for separating them in the first place. Compared to the other fathers that never gave up, it really shows the impact that you could have on a child even when you're separated from them, you can still inspire them while never giving up hope that they'll grow up to not endure the same types of hurdles. I will talk about that poll another time, but what I said about Fuga ends up actually making Grion and the Dark King's situation even worse. No one talks about this, but the Dark Kings are essentially Grion's parents. Yeah, they created Grion to infiltrate and destroy alchemist society from within, as they call it, the dolls of the doll that they made on a whim. And some of you already have watched Gotchard and some of you haven't, so let's break this down. Atropos lacks empathy, but at least cares about Rinne and her dad in her own twisted way. Clotho seemed only strengthened and obsessed, but only wanted to keep her family together and has some level of respect for Hotaro. And Lancaster started out as a sadist, but turned out to be more empathetic and got on a better path, thanks to her concern and better treatment from people like Minato, Spanner, and Kyoka. And Grion's fatherhood shows why they're better off without him. He gaslights and manipulates Atropos into becoming worse and obsessed with him, only to use her at best for Chimera, and reveals he never cared about her and just mimicked what Fuga did with Rinne to get her to love him, and something to spite Fuga for if Rinne was killed too. Then with Clotho, he tricks her into thinking he accepts Lachesis back, and he ruthlessly kills Lachesis after experimenting on her, attempting to replace and eliminate her. And the Dark Kings aren't much better. Godzilla actively used Clotho and Atropos, the latter especially to cause mutual death with Rinne, and Germain literally spent his time taunting them about how they ate his father. Gigas is at least more reasonable than Gideon, but still punishes them anyway. Yet in a strange sense of irony, he ends up being the only one to accept his defeat and being surpassed by his successor in Spanner. Moral of the story, some people really need to escape their toxic fathers since his sisters ended up being more sympathetic than the creator and the creator's creator. Finally, we get to Gav. Dente is Shoma's granduncle, but is clearly the best father figure for Shoma and his friends given Shoma's actual parent and Boche is a monster. But it all starts with Zomb, who started their sweets business into a drug empire ready to take over the Grand New World, with all of their children, save for Shoma, being anti-human exploiters for their drug trade. And look no further than how Zomb's son Boche was. He put his son under house arrest, forced him into brutal training, and later, similar to the rest of his kids, never realized he was influencing his children to become as cruel and evil as him. And in his death, his kids were inspired to become human-hating sociopaths that barely look after each other and hate Shoma for being half-human. Like, yeah, he trained Shoma, and Dente claimed that Boche loved Shoma, trying to modify Shoma's Gav to work, and he cared enough about his human wife and Shoma to keep them away from the rest of his family, and he even threatened the rest of his family with punishment if they ever dared to harm him. But because Boche forced Michiru to even be with him against her will and treated them both harshly, of course only Shoma's gonna see him in a negative light. The series ain't over yet, so like Jose, there might be more shades of gray that would back up Dente's claims, but until then, we'll just have to wait and see.